Some days when you're making dinner at home, you just want to make something that makes you feel good, something that's comforting. If it's cold, it's rainy, it's nasty, you want something that just warms your heart. And today's dish is going to be exactly that. It's shepherd's pie. Now, before we get started, let me go ahead and correct one error that people have with regards to shepherd's pie. And that's that you can use any kind of meat. In reality, you can make a dish very similar to this with any kind of meat. But if you want to make shepherd's pie, it requires a very specific ingredient. In fact, I have it right here. Ground lamb. Lamb is what makes it shepherd's pie. If it's beef, it's cottage pie. If it's fish, it's fisherman's pie. So the idea is the same, but shepherd's pie quintessentially uses this right here, which is ground lamb, something they absolutely have in abundance in places like England and Scotland. So, without further ado, let's get down to exactly how we make them. All of these ingredients are basically available at any run-of-the-mill grocery store. So let's walk through them real quick. So we have our ground lamb. Now, fat content on ground lamb tends to be 20 to 25%. It's not very lean meat, but the fat is kind of what keeps us full and makes it super flavorful. So that's what we have right here. And I buy this from my grocery store, from my butcher. They grind it every day, so it's super available. I also have onions. Just plain Jane onions. Now I'm using sweet onions because, well, I live in Georgia, so I have access to the best onions in the world, the Vidalia onion. But you could use anything you want. Yellow onions, white onions, you could even use red onions or shallots in a pinch, I imagine. Over here I have kind of the other two ingredients that make up your classic mirepoix. So that's some diced celery and some diced carrots. Again, very, very common, and the ratio, by the way, is twice as much onions to celery to carrot. So that's kind of how that works out. Now this ingredient back here is not in every recipe for shepherd's pie, but it was certainly in the version that I grew up with, and it's a little bit of extra root vegetable in the form of turnips. I love turnips. In fact, they are my favorite vegetable. I love how they're kind of spicy and crunchy, and they also have a little bit of a sweetness to them. And for me, they really bring out all of the flavors here. So to get this started, well, we got to start cooking our meat. And the fat of choice to get this started is this right here, beef tallow. Because, well, you don't want lamb tallow, and I promise you that. It probably sounds crazy for us to be using beef fat to cook lamb, but lamb fat can get out of control quick. All right, guys, let's get started. We're going to go ahead and add our fat to the pan. We're cooking this over high heat, by the way. We want this to be super, super hot. That way we get nice caramelization. Okay, guys. Our pan is super hot. Let's go ahead and start adding our meat to it. Be careful. Don't splash yourself. So that looks like the right amount to me. So I started with about 1.6, 1.7 pounds. I thought I probably had too much. In reality, it looks like this holds about a pound, which should be plenty of shepherd's pie for 4 to 6 people, which is a reasonable portion. So all I'm doing with my spoon is just tapping this out to get more surface contact for the meat so that we get a better, more even degree of browning all across this before we start adding our vegetables to it. Okay, guys, once our meat is for the most part brown, which you can see, quite a bit of fat left in here, we have a nice golden brown color to everything. We're going to start adding our vegetables. So we're going to add the carrots, the onions, the celery all at one time. And we might not need all of these, by the way, so let's just kind of scoop out what we do need. That looks pretty good. And then the same for onions. Awesome. So we'll give this a stir here. And when I stir it, by the way, I'm kind of breaking up the meat because I prefer my shepherd's pie to have kind of a smoother, almost like a meat gravy underneath rather than really big chunks in it. All right, well, let's let this veg sweat down in here, begin to take on a little bit of color. It'll probably cook 6 or 7 minutes before we move on to our next couple ingredients. Now that we have some good color on this and our vegetables have become really vibrant, I mean, you can see the celery, and it takes on a really, really bright green color. We know that we can now move on to the next step, which is adding a few more ingredients. Now, shepherd's pie needs a lot of different stuff to kind of build this rounded out, really robust flavor, and obviously herbs factor in that. We have 3 different types of herbs here. We have some bay leaves, which I'm going to go ahead and chuck in, And then we have some rosemary and some thyme. I just kind of quickly ran a knife through these so that they're not so big, because we're not going to fish them out. We will pull the bay leaves out before we put it in the baking dish. So sprinkle these in, toss it in this fat, and allow it to start building its flavor. A lot of herbs are actually fat soluble, meaning that their flavors don't really come out until the presence of fat. So take this opportunity to let them cook for 30 seconds or so before we move on to the next ingredient. So the next ingredients for us are those turnips that we diced up. Let's go ahead and add those in here. Again, we might not need all of them, so I have a little bit left over. And let's add some garlic. I've turned this into a paste, meaning that I've chopped the garlic up, I've chopped it again, and then I've sprinkled a little bit of salt over it and run my knife back and forth in a rocking motion until it's really, really small. I don't want any big bites of garlic in this. I just want that flavor to meld through everything. I really wish that you guys could smell this because it's so aromatic right now. It's just absolutely brilliant. I love this stuff. All right, next ingredient for us is going to be tomato paste. What we're looking for here is about, 2 tablespoons of tomato paste, which is actually a pretty large amount. Give it a good stir through and keep stirring this for about 35 to 45 seconds as this tomato paste browns. If you don't, it'll stick to the bottom and it's going to burn. All right, it doesn't take long for this tomato paste to build a nice caramelization in the pan. And then we're going to add a little bit of all-purpose flour. That's what I have in this bag right here. Now, I go with kind of 2 heaping spoonfuls here. This is what's thickening our gravy, basically. Now, the problem is that unlike a normal roux, you're not really going to be able to see that you have the right amount. So you're kind of eyeballing it here. But what I find is 2 big, soup spoon kind of things is about right. In reality, that's probably 1/4 cup of all-purpose flour. Give it a stir and really, really stir it through. And then I'm going to turn my heat off while I finish mixing all of this up. You have a lot of choices when it comes to which liquid to use to build your sauce. Some people go with chicken stock, some people go with water. Now my preference is to use a little bit of beef broth, which is what I have here, 2 cups, and then this ingredient. And I think this is really what makes it. Guinness in a can. Works great. Not my favorite for drinking. Guinness is a lot better on draft, but Guinness in a can makes a fantastic gravy for shepherd's pie. So let's go ahead and pour those in. We're going to use half of this can and the full 2 cups of broth. Okay guys, so our lamb gravy, if you want to call it that, our stew, has been cooking for about 40 minutes now with the lid on behind me, and I've just turned the heat off. So let's open this thing up and take a look at it really quick. I'm going to grab a spoon. This looks really, really nice to me. It's nice and creamy, it's got good color to it, but it's not quite finished. Let's set it aside though for a second and talk about the other main ingredient for shepherd's pie, which is the mashed potato part of it. But it's not made like a normal mashed potato, and that's one of the ways that people get this wrong sometimes. They try to make a super creamy mashed potato that would be delicious with something else, but your shepherd's pie mashed potato needs to be, well, just not quite that creamy. Let me show you. I have some potatoes over here. So these potatoes have been simmering until they're nice and tender. I mean, completely soft. Absolutely, no real texture to them, but they haven't exploded yet either. They haven't turned into potato soup. And that's really important because if they cook too long, they'll actually get really, really watery. So these are perfect. Now I've cut them up in chunks and I put a really, really big handful of salt, covered them in water, and cooked them until they were tender. So I didn't show you guys that because, well, I trust that you guys can boil potatoes. But this is where it starts to get a little bit different. So I have a pound of potatoes in here. And normally, I'm not big on the potato masher. I'm actually kind of a food mill or a ricer guy, but I've found that for a shepherd's pie, this works a little bit better. So, to my pound of potatoes, I'm gonna add 4 tablespoons of butter, which maybe that sounds like a lot to you, but I'll tell you that normally for a pound of potatoes when I'm making mashed potatoes at home, I'm using half to a full pound of butter. So this is a very small amount. I'm also adding some heavy cream to this. Now, I'm going to start with about 3 ounces, give or take. I have 6 ounces in this little pitcher here, and I'm just going to start to crush this up. Now, I like the mashed potato for shepherd's pie to be a little bit more rustic. To me, this is not a dish that's about making look uber fancy. It's about making it uber tasty. And so this sort of rougher, coarser mashed potato makes perfect sense to me. Now, as I start breaking this up, I'm mashing the milk, or the cream in this case, and the butter into the potatoes. Really, really, really making sure that I break up the big pieces, but obviously this is gonna be a lumpy mashed potato because I'm using this thing. So I'm okay with that. Now, once I get to sort of this stage right here, where it looks pretty much like mashed potatoes, I'm gonna take this rubber spatula here, and I'm just gonna check. I'm just gonna make sure that I don't have any milk and butter kind of stuck in places, and that I don't have any big pieces of potato, which I do have a little bit here, so I'll pass this through one more time. I'm also gonna use this opportunity to kind of give myself my first taste of it. Now, this works out perfect because I added enough salt when I simmered it. In other words, I put enough salt in the water that these potatoes are perfectly seasoned. This is the step, though, that if you didn't, if you had a little bit lighter hand with it, you could add some more salt. It doesn't look like I'm going to need to add any more salt, so I'm kind of good to go there. I do want to run this potato masher through a couple more times, just to break up any of the really big pieces. Now, you have an option at this point. If you want your topping to be like a cheesy mashed potato, now's the time. You would add your cheese to this right now and fold it through. I like cheese on it, but that's not, to me, the sort of quintessential shepherd's pie. To me, the cheese almost distracts away from the really robust flavor of the lamb itself. So I want to add more fat, and I want to add something that kind of makes it a little nicer, but I don't want to add cheese. And my answer has always been egg yolks. In this case, 4 of them. So 1 egg yolk per tablespoon of butter. That's kind of the ratio I go with here. And the reason I add the egg yolks is A, it'll have a really beautiful golden color when it bakes, but that extra fat is going to make this toast up really, really well. But unlike adding more butter or even cheese to it, the egg yolks can't break away from it. So it'll never get greasy. It'll just look really nice, frankly. So let's give this a stir just to make sure that it's not too warm, because we don't want to scramble the eggs when we add it to this. And in fact, I would say this is a little bit too warm. So let's set it aside 2 or 3 minutes just to cool down a little bit more, and then we'll stir in our egg yolks to it. Okay guys, we let our potatoes sit for just a second, basically just till they stop steaming. That's going to be cool enough for us to add our egg yolks. And let's just pour these in here, and then really work them in. I mean, I say that. We want to make sure they're very evenly mixed, but we actually don't want to overly stir our mashed potato because it'll just kind of become gluey. So stir those in. And by the way, I added that cream and that butter ice cold, like straight from the refrigerator cold, which also probably sounds bananas, but it was intentional. I was trying to cool my mashed potato down as quickly as I could because I find that cold or room temperature mashed potatoes work way better on a shepherd's pie than ones that are piping hot. All right, there we go. Look at that. That's super pretty. Nice, beautiful yellow color. When this bakes, it's gonna be exceptionally good. So let's set this aside for a second and let's settle up what we have to do with the lamb gravy. So we have our lamb here. Just pull it over to our cutting board for a second. And let's go ahead, before we do anything else, let's fish out those bay leaves. You never wanna bite into one of these things. They taste good when simmered in a sauce. They taste like, well, a leaf when you eat them. So, find them. We know we had 3. There we go. It's number 3. Dig them out. All right. So this is our gravy, and it's tasty. I mean, I like it the way that it is right now. Super lamby, really flavorful. But I know we can make it better. And I have a couple ingredients that are pretty obvious. Some black pepper. Grind some of that in here. But the next ingredients aren't as obvious. The first is this right here. Bovril. Well, this is actually Bovrite. This is an American-made brand. I grew up with the British or English-made one in my grandmother's house. And Bovril, or Bovrite, is beef. It's beef extract. Beef and vegetable extract, to be exact. And weirdly enough, my grandmother would take this and put it in a cup of hot water and drink it, like tea, which apparently is a very real thing that people do. Or we'd eat it on toast, which is delicious, but incredibly salty. What I like it for is in small quantities inside gravies, especially beef or lamb gravies, because it will add a lot of that salt, but it's also going to intensify the flavor of this. It's got a bouillon-like quality to it, but it's more than that. It's hard to explain. You just have to taste it. So let's give that a stir through. All right, so we got our Bovril added here. The next ingredient really has a soft spot in my heart. HP sauce. I love this stuff. It's the condiment that as a kid was my absolute favorite. You eat it on meat pies or on little sausage sandwiches or bacon sandwiches. Very, very British. It's kind of like A1, but it doesn't taste as... Let's add some HP sauce to this. Not too much because it'll get a little out of control, but it's got a really good flavor to it. It's kind of raisiny, pomegranate-y. I don't know. It's hard to explain. But we're going to add a little bit of that in here. And we'll give that a stir as well. Finally, let's add a little bit of color to it. You know, let's make it look like something, as a chef I used to work with would say. I got a little bit of flat leaf parsley here. We're going to add it because, well, the green flecks look nice, but also, honestly, because fresh parsley just has an incredible ability to make things taste more fresh. It kind of just wakes up the flavors of stuff. And I don't need to cut this like crazy. You know, to use a Fergus Henderson line, a very famous English chef, I'm not trying to destroy this. I'm just trying to discipline it. So in other words, we're just passing our knife through it a handful of times just to make it a bit smaller before we chuck it all into our pot here. All right, let's give this one last stir, give it a taste, see what we're working with here. All right, let's taste it. That's delicious. I mean, the flavor is intense because lamb is intense, but it's really nice. And our seasoning of adding that sort of beef extract and adding the HP sauce, it really just kind of rounds the flavor out. It doesn't ruin it. You still get the lamb for sure, but it wakes everything up and it just makes it delicious. And remember, we're burying this underneath a layer of mashed potato. So we sort of over-season the lamb part because the potato is very neutral in flavor. So for everything to taste well seasoned, we kind of have to heavy hand this a little bit. Okay guys, so let's build this thing. It's really straightforward. Ratios are important here, but at the end of the day, make it like the way you like it. You know, that's what I always tell people. So I have a Le Creuset baking pan of an unknown size. I think it's 9 by 9, give or take. But it doesn't really matter what size your pan is. It's more about how much will fit in it. So let's start by putting down the gravy. Now I'm not buttering or oiling or greasing this thing in any way. I don't see any need for that because we have plenty of fat in this. So we're layering this down in the bottom. And it's nice and, like, you see how much sauce we have. That's what we want because the potato kind of drinks up some of that sauce, if we're being honest. That's why we want a more dry potato. So I think we can get pretty much everything in here. Looks that way. Let's scrape this out of there. Okay guys, so we have our meat sauce in our pan. Now we just have to add our potato. Now, I don't do this in any particularly elegant way. I sort of go in and just add dollops of potato along the way. We'll go back and kind of smooth them out a little bit, but not really, because I think it ends up looking nicer if you have kind of these peaks and valleys along the way. So just keep adding your potato, and I'm just using my rubber spatula, and fill it up. We're trying to fill all the creases there. All right, once you have your potato on, I just use like an offset spatula here to kind of make sure that I have total coverage. I'm trying to make sure that the sauce, for the most part, doesn't leak out underneath. If it does a little bit, that's no big deal, but I don't want tons of it leaking out. So I just kind of use this to spread it over the top. Now, I'm a high meat to potato ratio kind of guy, but if you're the other way around and your favorite thing in the entire world is mashed potato, then feel free to double the amount. You can have mashed potato coming out of the top if you want. That's just not my personal preference. I'm more there for the meat gravy. Okay guys, this is our fully assembled shepherd's pie. We have our meat on the bottom, we have our potato on the top. All we have to do is bake this thing. So I have it setting on a baking sheet just because sometimes it'll spill off the side. Hopefully it doesn't this time. Let's pop it in our oven, 375 degrees Fahrenheit. When? Till it's golden brown and delicious. GBD, that's what we work with here, baby. Let's pop it in. It's probably, in reality, 20 minutes. All right, guys, this is it. Our finished shepherd's pie, and it looks so freaking delicious. So our gravy bubbled up around the sides. Our potato is nice and brown on the top, and it's nice and firm from the egg being added to it. It's just, this is gonna be so good. Now the hardest part is that if you eat this right now, it is like magma. It will burn every cell off of your tongue. So do yourself a favor and let this thing sit. It is gonna stay piping hot for 45 minutes to an hour, so there is no rush. I'm gonna set mine over here on the stove. I'm gonna wait for my wife to get home, and we're gonna have this for dinner. So guys, thank you very, very much. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you enjoyed all of the ones you've seen so far. Come back and see me again. Take care. Haggis, do you like shepherd's pie? You like tummy rubs? And shepherd's pie.